Hi everyone, I'm Effie Gale. Today I am in a hotel in Canberra. I am here for the Aurealis Awards. One of my stories is a finalist for the Best Horror Short Story category, which is really exciting. So I thought I would do a bit of a vlog for today. Hopefully I've taken some footage for my trip earlier today and some kind of getting ready activities. So if that all worked out, you should be seeing some of that from about now. And I also really wanted to talk about horror and what is horror, because obviously my story is a finalist for the Best Horror Short Story category, but I actually don't know whether I would classify it as horror, and that's a little bit what I would like to talk to you about today. So first of all, I want to jump back a bit about 18 months ago when I first looked up my entry in the Internet Speculative Fiction database, and I was really excited to see that someone had put stories in there for me in that entry and that I did have a listing there. But what I was really surprised about was that there was a tag there next to my entry that said horror. And I perhaps would have been a little bit less surprised if it had said, fantasy, science fiction and horror, but it didn't. It just had the one lone horror tag. And that really, really surprised me because I have never thought of myself as a horror writer. I've never intentionally written a horror story. And that's the reason I really wanted to discuss this with you guys today. Obviously there are various ways that we define genre, and generally my understanding of horror is that it's written with the intent to scare or to discomfort. And, it's one of those genres that is centered around how it makes the reader feel versus something like fantasy, which is determined by that kind of world building aspect of whether magic is present or not. And, I don't intend to scare or discomfort when I write. None of my stories have been written with that in mind. I actually don't write my stories with the intent to make the reader feel anything at all, except maybe interest. I don't want them to be bored, I want them to be engaged in the story, but I never write with the intent of making them feel a certain emotion like happiness or grief or anything like that. I certainly wouldn't criticize people who do write with that goal in mind, but to me personally that would feel a little bit manipulative. My goal is just to write the best story that I can, and the reader's experience of the story is their own. I don't really want to try and influence that beyond, again, trying to make sure that I write a good story that's going to keep their interest. So I've watched my fair share of horror and read my fair share as well, but I certainly wouldn't consider myself an expert in the field. I generally don't really like to be scared. I can enjoy horror for other aspects, but for instance, I've watched several series of American Horror Story, and my favorites tend to be the ones where I'm the least scared. There have been ones that really have scared me quite a bit, and that does tend to reduce them in my enjoyment levels. So aside from the intent, the other aspect of horror, as I understand it, is horror tropes. And that there are these collection of tropes that tend to be in horror and that, I've never intentionally put into any of my stories, or at least not with that intention. So again, I'm by no means an expert, but the only trope that I can immediately think of in my finalist story that might be considered a horror trope is demons attack and kill everybody. And I know that you're probably thinking, Effie, that sounds really like a horror trope. But I would say it depends on the tone with which it's written. So for instance, that could be in a comedy story, or it could be in a war story, or it could be in what I would personally consider my finalist story to be, which is a dark fantasy. So this is probably a good time to talk a little bit about that finalist story itself. So the story is called Traces of Us Hot Enough for Dinner. And the title actually has a little bit of a brief story in and of itself. One day, quite some time ago now, I was looking at a kind of artificial intelligence text generator where you could give it a bunch of text and then it would generate some phrases based on the text that you had inputted. And I inputted the entirety of my short story collection called Next Curious Thing. So I inputted all of that text, which is about 60,000 words worth of story, and it spat me out various AI generated phrases based on that text. And most of them were no good, but one of them that did stand out to me was this phrase, "traces of us hot enough for dinner." And I thought, I like that, and I saved it in a notepad file. And later on, after I'd actually written this story, I remembered that I had this potential title sitting there, and I thought, this is a really nice matchup. I'm going to use this title for this story. So that's the story of the title, and I'll tell you a little bit about the story itself. So it is about a young woman who, a year prior to the story beginning, her fiance was killed in a car accident. And now, on the present day of the story, she is expected to go to this wedding that she doesn't really want to go to. And at the end of the day, and when they're having the wedding dinner, suddenly the wedding is crashed by this horde of demons who kills everyone. And then she realizes that she's in a time loop and the day starts again. And again, she's expected to go to this wedding on the anniversary of her fiance's death. And again, the demons come once the sun sets. And this happens many times. And I won't spoil the ending for you in case you're interested in reading the story, but that's in a nutshell what it's about. So I did submit this story in both the fantasy and horror categories for the Aurealis Awards. I personally, again, would consider it dark fantasy more than horror, but people kept telling me that I wrote horror, so I thought, okay, I'm not going to shoot myself in the foot. Let's submit it to the horror category as well, and the judges can decide. And obviously they decided that they thought it was horror. So I guess that's the conclusion that I'm coming to these days, that ultimately it doesn't really matter what I think that the genre of my story, or in fact any story, really is. Genres are really there for readers so that they can pick up other stories that are similar to ones that they've liked in the past, and that they have some idea of what they're getting before they open the story or the book. So if readers want to categorize my story as horror because they like horror and they want to read more horror and they want to read more stories by me, I'm certainly not going to say no. And likewise, if the judges of the Aurealis Awards want to put my story as a finalist in the Best Horror Short Story category, I'm certainly not going to say no either. So I think that's all that I wanted to say here. Hopefully this vlog, which is the first vlog I've ever done, turns out not too bad, and it's probably just about time for me to think about heading off to the Aurealis Awards themselves. So we'll see. Hello again, I'm just back from the Aurealis Awards ceremony. I didn't win. Massive congrats to Don't Look, who did win the Best Horror Short Story category. They did give me this medal as one of the finalists, which I am very appreciative of. Thank you for the medal. And it was just in general a really lovely night. Met lots of nice people, very interesting, good conversation. Felt very welcome, so thank you very much for a wonderful ceremony and a wonderful night in general, Aurealis Awards committee and everyone involved. Cheers.